Elizabeth Robinson is an author of several poetry books. I think the last one being It's Coming, The Orphan It's Coming, published by Fence Books. Otherwise, her new volume is, I think, forthcoming later this year. So please welcome Elizabeth.
I'm very grateful to be here, and I think that Kim just went out, but I don't think this could have happened without Kim's energy and generosity, so I just want to mark that, and I wish she was here, but maybe when she comes back, we can applaud for her. Thank you, Kim. And I also want to just register a moment of intimidation being here, and so I'm trying out a reading of your work, Robert, and I hope that you like it. And if you don't, you can tell me so later. For the poet whose oracle famously told us, as already Pierre has said, to write everything, and who has also famously gone on to do so, under what other circumstance could a reader peruse the individual title she owns by a poet and feel vaguely ashamed that she only owns 30? The erotic forward rush of language would seem to indicate a compelling and positive interest in the transcendent capabilities of language. That is, language, specifically Kelly's poetic language, evinces what I decided was an optimism and energy that language is adequate to reach out. Okay, now you're here. We have to say thank you.
My pleasure. Let me just put this water here. And do you think you could just take a moment to remind everybody that the Rothenberg piece that Phong alluded to is actually in a separate broadside that's available?
Okay.
Beautiful, thank you.
So, that is, language is adequate to reach out. Transcendence constructs itself around the accretions of renewing curiosity, which I think of it as the great poetic gift that Robert generously passes out to all of us. Kelly drives the poem forward into the ever-shifting frontier of what can be known, perceived, recognized. I use the term transcendent in the Kantian sense as that which goes beyond or transcends any possible knowledge on the part of a human being. As he says, like a shapely sentence never running out. Though Kelly also has described this anecdotally. All through that same life dawning, there kept getting clearer and clearer a vision, too fancy a word, a sense, just a sense, of what I was to do with my energies. And it had to do with the violation of boundaries, with a reaching out toward the totality of human feeling, and knowing and wanting, turning that transgression into a structure of its own. In Kelly's orientation toward the irresolvable dilemma of such transcendence, he engages with language as it casts its intentions and queries always forward of itself, in the leap of faith that we take to be meaning, even if what we mean by meaning is something transient, modeled, continually mediated. I see this risk as characteristic of the generosity and, as I said, the ultimate optimism of his work. Kelly states in his interview with Brad Morrow, "Here, the political hope and the spiritual hope of poetry become one. Language is aspiration." Approaches to anything as problematic as the transcendent, however we may define it, are best carried out with stealth, and in fact are barely permissible in poetic conversation, as we all well know by now. So I want to suggest that Kelly has developed a repertoire of strategies for contending with the obstacles inherent in such a project as his is. Among them, erudition, prodigious energy, reverence, irreverence, lasciviousness, sensuality, commitment, humor, empathy, disobedience, attention, sly inattentions. Perhaps the slyest, stealthiest sneaking up upon strategy toward the imagined wholeness of the transcendent is Kelly's multiplicative, many-voiced, multi-hued, infinitely worded, and eventually deceptive engagement with the excessive. At first blush, his appears as a cataphatic poetry, that is, by positively engaging with language's ability to create, Kelly gestures and reaches out to, if not the divine, a richly envisioned world of possibility that he has called the sheer power of language to achieve the instauration of a new world. Every poet should be Columbus. The invocational quality of Robert's poetry has always moved me. To call to and to name is to conjure. The endless conjurations that constitute Robert's body of work renew his vision and ours in the most fecund of ways. Even while acknowledging that language is in permanent détente, the poet returns again and again to rhapsodically name his world and there fulfill its being. Here's a quote from Lapis. No logic, I went on, growing confident, but the logic of the secret alphabet, the hidden firmament behind the sky, the eternally proliferating sculpture of light and warmth and turbulence through which we move all our lives and never look at, never see. Stare into boiling water and see the endlessness of art, the changefulness of beauty. It is movement. It is all movement. It is nothing but movement observed and cherished, lovingly observed and understood. Poetry is a generative, mobile interaction, calling on the artifacts of the world in order to make that world. For the restless movement of our conversations leave records in the world. These memoranda, in fact, comprise the world, not thought into place, talked into place. The formidable force and resource of the poet wrestles the world into being through language. Relatedly, I love and find pertinent this bit from Robert's interview with Brad Morrow. Interlocutor, you're raving a bit. Kelly, raving is permitted. So is drollness, acuity, measure, sarcasm, sentiment, hope. So is precise knowledge, the names of persons and cities, dead languages, and living women. So is hope. So your excess is an excess of aspiration, it sounds like. When it comes down to it, what really does compel you to do it? To say everything I can. I want to say everything that language can. What else is there to say? Even so, the secret alphabet, the memoranda of the world, almost always belie themselves in the circuit of a Kelly poem. The boiling water that comprises the endlessness of art does tend to boil itself away, evaporated. Here in the cataphatic chorus of his poetry, Kelly faints, steps aside, and opens a via negativa that is the truer heart of his work. One can see this straddling between cataphasis and apophasis, I'm never sure if I'm saying that right, in a continuity where Kelly writes, the persistent manifestations of change under the gloss of lustrous seeming permanence is what the stream had to tell her. I am a name that lingers while the other things I am run by. So much was obvious. Run dry. Persistent enactment of what isn't even there to mean is what the story is telling her, is what the telling told her. I have told myself a story in a million voices and called it a world. As so often in a Kelly poem, the ecstatic activity of voicing and naming turns sinuously into the paradox of an enactment of what isn't even there to mean. Here's the apophatic moment that necessarily recurs across Kelly's poems, the unsaying that demonstrates mystery by performing rather than asserting referential openness. As much as Kelly is a poet who desires to experience everything in language, he continually undoes that everything in silence, retraction, and contradiction. And then I get born and inherit my silence. Apophasis works this way. The effort to name, to conjure, that is the basis of cataphatic theology, inevitably results in limiting and circumscribing the transcendent. By contrast, apophasis strives for the referential openness of negative definition, not that. Even this process, however, immediately runs up against its own difficulties, as an extended quotation from Michael Sells will clarify. To say X is beyond names, if true, entails that it cannot then be called by name X. In turn, the statement, it cannot be then called X, becomes suspect because the it as a pronoun substitutes for a name, but the transcendent is beyond all names. As I attempt to state the aporia of transcendence, I'm caught in a linguistic regress. Each statement I make, positive or negative, reveals itself as in need of correction. The correcting statement must then itself be corrected ad infinitum. The authentic subject of discourse slips continually back beyond each effort to name it or even to deny its nameability. Consider now a poem called Advertisement, which I'll quote in its brief entirety. Kelly offers what could just as well be a paraphrase of Sells. There is a biblical quality in poetry, an impassioned rush to revelation. But just as in the actual Bible, each revelation is just another mystery. The curtain is swept aside to expose something even more concealed than what had hidden it. Language can never cast itself off. Its satin becomes the skin, as you can tell when you look close at the soft luster nearest your hand. And blood, too, is veiled in light. Here we have an irresolvable quandary, one so luscious that none of us, it seems, can resist it, least of all Robert Kelly. How to resist the beguilements of language, how to use the tool of saying to properly unsay. In this, Kelly's process, the linguistic regress of modification, correction, and alternate recognitions acquires lavish textures and an eros all its own. Striving toward the site where the transcendent and the immanent conjoin and what I'll provisionally call mystical union, the immanent is supercharged. The poet creature cannot know this transcendence except through an affirmation of radical immanence. That which is beyond is within. That which is other is the non-other. Kelly's poetry overflows at exactly this conjunction. It is in language that desires are stored. Our bodies take out, try on, use to quench the moral thirst the pronouns sing. And a mere 2 pages later in Lapis, everything tries to answer the question at once. This eagerness begets a material world. You know better than I how close we are. My name is the same as yours, only the letters are different. Tumbling sensuously in the bedclothes of the immanent and the transcendent, one is brought to a state akin to what Fanny Howe calls bewilderment. In the clutch of that pleasure, one finally shuts up and lets the silence in, at least for a moment. And in the dawning confidence that there will be other moments, intersections, maybe many of them akin to this one. What is most important here is that language ceases to be a thing, an object, or subject, and subverts itself into an event. In Kelly's rendering, the transcendent is not a mode of knowing, but a mode of being that becomes its own unfolding disontology, its own process. To know the truth of things is to be on a ladder of matter, reaching broken, rung by rung to the mezzanine of soul, from which, far off, the gasping guesser sees cloudlessly far in blue the hills of mind. The poem as event and movement provides Kelly with the ability to create a wedge in the nature of the world, or clock whose numbers change, frequenter than hands, which I read yesterday from For Mary. Seen this way, the linguistic regress of apophysis that originates in a sort of doubt, the doubt that the transcendent can be named adequately, is transformed into affirmation in Robert Kelly's work. The desire to continue on, discovering new intersections and possibilities within language that might otherwise ossify and close down. See how elegantly he articulates the crafting of this process. It's also a spiritual necessity, because our habit patterns are best reflected in our usual syntactic orders and the kind of natural fluency great writers have. They become fresh or great through wonderful syntactic inattention that at some moment they suddenly pay attention to. This coming to attend makes a difference between a type A and a Moby Dick. It makes the difference between writing that keeps one writing deeper into the system and writing that might liberate one from it. Can we understand from this or relate it to Kelly's statement that my answer to the adequate is the excessive? Excess is a startling apophatic strategy, but it keeps language aloft as engagement and not stasis. Its returns and recognitions take us through wonderful inattention to that silent place we have not encountered before, into moments of liberation. This puts me in mind of the radical Old Testament's conception of devotion as so giving oneself over oneself and estate to the divine that the result is destruction. The liberation here is an act of faith indeed, but as Robert has said, eventually most of my words will be gone. Each loss changes the artifact remaining. I'm more interested in the changes, the silences to come. Which generative, paradoxical wedge in the nature of the world is where I would like to end. The moment when words fit together and space itself shows through or refuses to fit together. And here we go, singing of it, that sacred absence which is what I mostly know of God, to love and to be sure, in the hollow place inside the solid world, just one word down.